Hi, this is Scott Ross, and you're listening to the Cinematography Podcast.
The following podcast contains explicit language. You're listening to the Cinematography Podcast presented by Hot Rod Cameras, a program about the art, craft, and philosophy of the moving image and the people who make it happen. Coming to you from the world headquarters of Hot Rod Cameras in Hollywood, California, are your hosts, Ben Rock and Ilya Friedman.
Hey there, Ben Rock.
Hey there, Ilya Friedman. How the heck are you?
I'm doing okay. It is time for another fine episode of the Cinematography Podcast. Who is on the show today?
This one is very, very exciting. Anyone who listened to our interview with Scott Liebrecht will note that I have a special affinity for visual effects. And we got to interview Scott Ross, the guy who freaking ran Digital Domain during, I would say, the golden age of Digital Domain. Holy crap, does this guy have some stories.
Fantastic. Well, we'll get into all of Scott Ross's stories in just a few minutes, but first, it's our
Close Focus.
We were talking a little bit right before hitting record that there is a lot of things sort of like going on right now. Where would you like to start?
Well, I'd like to start with a super bummer, if I could, but I think it's the kind of thing that our listeners should know about. And I don't feel like it got enough news. You know, when we have a situation like the shooting on the film set of Rust, that becomes big news because, you know, giant movie star pulls a trigger that kills a cinematographer, wounds a director, horrible tragedy, and we've talked about it a lot. But less talked about are the more common fatalities that come out of other bad practices within the film industry. For instance, Rico Priem, who is a grip on 911, died in a car crash after working several 14-hour days in a row, as reported by his IATSE Local 80. And it reminds me of a great documentary that Haskell Wexler made called Who Needs Sleep? And the kind of toxic practices that our industry will have because sometimes they have more money than time, so they don't care if they send many crew people into, you know, whatever triple golden time. I don't know, you know, just crazy overtime. They don't care because they got to get their show done on time, and so they'll work these people literally to death. It just breaks my heart. As someone who makes films, it breaks my heart when I hear about people abusing crew. And on episodic, it's especially lame to me because a show like 911, they're going to do this episode and then they're going to do the next episode and the next episode, and they're going to keep making this show forever. So why the necessity for the long hours? If you can't get the show done in normal human hours, then maybe you need to add a day to your schedule. Maybe you need to figure out other places to cut costs. But as my first film teacher ever, Michael Corbett, once told me, no shot is ever worth hurting anybody. And I would go further than that to say there's no episode of 911 or a scene from Citizen Kane or Vertigo. It doesn't matter what it is. Accidents are going to happen. We can't prevent accidents from happening in the world, but we can take precautions to not literally kill our own. So I'm sorry to start on such a bummer, but stuff like this just frustrates me that this becomes a regular thing that's expected. Crew people talk about Fraturday, for instance, you know, when Friday
and Saturday
bleeds into Saturday. And I don't mean to be like this. I feel like if you're off making a one-off awesome, if you're off making Barton Fink and it's going to be this classic movie, it's okay to ask people once in a while to like go that extra mile for you. Maybe if you've really built trust and you're working really hard on it. But and I'm not denigrating anyone who writes or directs or produces shows like 911 or NCIS or whatever.
No, but
like
what
these
you're
shows
saying
go
is,
on forever.
And you know what? They frankly should be held to a higher standard because they're producing so many more hours for that show than most features are. It's like the finished running time of a feature of 2 hours approximately, give or take, versus like a television series, which is grinding out probably between, I'm going to say 9 on the short end and like 24 on the long end for a number of hours of television. I got to say I hold television to a higher standard than for organization and having their shit together, having their schedule together, having all of that stuff that's so important that frankly, when they don't do it right, costs people their lives. That's really not okay. So,
yeah, and by the way, just a few more details about this. Priyam left work a little after 4 a.m. and was driving his Toyota Highlander on the 57 freeway to San Dimas when, for unknown reasons. So Priyam's shift on Friday was his second 14-hour production day in a row.
Yeah, and also San Dimas is like one of those weird areas that's just sort of barely inside the studio zone. Yeah. It's like,
And I've been there, man. Like, I remember working on a show in Santa Clarita. Those who aren't local Angelinos should know Santa Clarita, not very far. It's technically within the zone, but it was overnights. And I was working on a show that was overnights, which meant, and Santa Clarita is like a bedroom community that feeds LA. People live there and work in LA. And there's only one highway that goes from Santa Clarita into LA. And I was getting done at, dawn, basically, whatever, 6:37 in the morning, and having to drive back what would usually take 20 minutes was taking an hour and a half, and it was a fight to stay awake, and that is understandable, but also we need to do better. I mean, obviously you're going to work some nights and you're going to be tired, but there are things you can do to prevent that from being a huge fatal problem.
And no excuse for it to be a regular thing. Like it shouldn't
yeah,
be.
I mean, again, like, we hear about the rust thing, but you just don't hear about people losing their hearing because they work around gunfire or people getting peppered with the stuff that comes out of the front of the gun. We only hear about the big scary one. And I think that there are a lot of not even necessarily deaths, but injuries that result from car accidents or other things like this from working people 14. And this isn't like being a key grip 14 hours a day. That's a very physical job.
Very physical. Yeah. Extremely.
Anyway, I could go on and on.
All right. So let's continue. So we also wanted to talk about something that I think a lot of people out there, particularly people who probably listen to or watch our show, have experienced but haven't really understood what it is that they're seeing. You ever watch something on streaming that is too dark and you go like, how possibly be supposed to be this dark right now? I can't see what's going on. Or there's weird, dark, nebulous sort of shadows that are kind of like merging and moving all around. Have you ever noticed this, Ben? Have you seen what I'm talking
whenever
about?
I encounter that, I always assume that there's something wrong with my television or that my television just isn't set up. Like, I want to think about, it was one of the big final battles in Game of Thrones that was so freaking dark that I couldn't see anything what was happening in it. And, that's Game of Thrones, gold standard of that kind of TV show. And anyway, but I just was always like, do I have the HDR settings wrong? Like, what have I done wrong on my television?
Chances are you've actually done nothing wrong. And if you've done some sort of even basic calibration, you're ahead of 90% of people out there. But the thing is that it is not your fault. It might not even be the creators of the project's fault. Like it probably wouldn't be anyone who actually produced or shot or made these things. When it comes to actually the distribution, when it comes to actually seeing the images on your set at home, that signal gets compressed way, way down, way down to a very, very, very thin stream.
This is a fine argument, by the way, for physical media, but do go on. I digress.
Dark black images tend to be some of the most intensive to have good image fidelity. And as far as the streamers are concerned, they're like, you know what, it's dark, people can't really see. They really, really dial down the bit rate. So the compression of artifacts get even worse in the dark, shadowy sort of areas, which is why you always see it there first. But director Michael Moen of the new movie Immaculate had to take to Twitter to defend his movie recently because people, the new Sydney Sweeney horror film, were on Twitter, X, and saying, hey, I can't see what's going on.
I will call it Twitter forever. I don't care. Maybe call me an old man. I'm not calling it X. An old man named it X. I'm not calling it X.
Anyway, I got to give Michael Moen props for getting on there and saying, hey, look, it's not us. Everything looks great in our digital intermediate. It looks great in the theater. It looks great at South by Southwest. And sure enough, there's a bunch of screenshots from different streaming services, and they actually gave props to Apple TV Plus. I think that they said that either Apple TV Plus or iTunes, one of them seemed to have less compression artifacts and had a brighter image, but some of the others were completely unwatchable. And I really, really want to see more stories like this. There's a story about it in the Hollywood Reporter, and I really want more customers of the streaming services out there to complain. There should be a complaint hotline. There's people who should be threatening to cancel or canceling their services over this. But as long as the streamers think they can get away with it, and as long as the consumer is uneducated as to what's going on, because it's entirely within the purview of the streamer to put more data, more bit rate into their stream. And as soon as they do that, your TV set looks great. Your TV set has no problems. It has everything to do with how cheap the streamers are with sending out those images in the first place. So physical media does not have these problems. And Christopher Nolan's been very outspoken about it and said, hey, I think people should see movies in the theater. And if you can't see it in the theater, you should invest in physical media. And there's something to be said about that because it is a much, much better experience. I keep saying that I think the blockbuster days may start to return. And really, when it comes down to it, if you can't see something and the streaming service is too cheap to actually give you enough bits to even let your box or your screen decode it properly, then I feel really bad about giving them money. I feel like, it's sacrilegious for them to destroy images and not care the way they do. So.
There have been more than one time where I saw a movie on Max that I had never seen before that I wanted to watch, and they were usually older movies. And HBO got the aspect ratio wrong and cropped in, and I could tell that they'd screwed it up because the titles were cut off on my television. And I'm like, okay, if we can't trust it from Max, how are we going to trust it from Pluto TV or Tubi or whoever else we go to? So to me, I don't personally buy a lot of Blu-rays anymore, but I do occasionally. And I think physical media, if it matters to you, and if we've learned nothing else from the poor performance of Furiosa last week, maybe the answer is it doesn't matter to most people. But if the experience of these films matters to you, you should want to see them as well as they can be seen.
I got to give a little bit of shade to the people who are really big proponents of HDR, including a lot of these streaming services, because they'll advertise and tout the fact that it's in HDR. But the HDR doesn't matter when you have those terrible compressions. It doesn't matter when your screen has got a
HDR means high, so it's good.
I remember I used to have an LG television set which could not recognize the correct flags from Netflix, and Ozark, at the time, my favorite show on television, looked so terrible in their brand new HDR. It was unwatchable. But as soon as I put it onto a set in standard definition mode, it looked incredible. It looked fine. There is nothing wrong with standard dynamic range. Dynamic range.
I had the same thing happen with Ozark. Ozark was so dark I couldn't see a freaking thing. I'm like, did they leave the lens cap on? And then I changed the settings on my TV and it looked great. It's a great looking show.
Yeah. So anyway, I think it's a good sort of cultural touch point having to do with the streaming services right now, because if people are talking about it and Hollywood Reporter is starting to run stories about it, then I think it's only a matter of time between now and some sort of action takes place, because as more people understand what it is and can vocalize it, that's how things start to change. So Ben, we also want to talk about one more thing. What was that thing?
It's kind of an AI news, but it reflects all over every industry all at once. Those tech bros, they're moving fast and breaking things again. And this time it's
whoops, we broke it.
I'm starting to think that breaking things might be bad. And maybe I don't want all my things broken by these tech assholes. So OpenAI and Sam Altman debuted these amazing sounding AI voices, right? Mm-hmm. And it's such a juicy and horrible and obnoxious story of tech being just a bunch of pricks. But basically, they had asked Scarlett Johansson, who famously played the voice of an AI in the Spike Jonze movie Her, if she would provide one of the voices, and she said no. So then they released all the voices, and here's a sample of the voice of, I believe the character's name is Sky, who is a virtual assistant that is not Scarlett Johansson.
Hey there, it's going great. How about you? I see you're rocking an OpenAI hoodie. Nice choice. Are you about to reveal something about AI? Or more specifically about me as a part of OpenAI? You've got me on the edge of I don't really have a seat, but you get the idea.
So basically, they got a sound-alike actor who kind of had a ScarJo kind of sounding voice and created a whole AI around her. And then, in a supreme act of balls, Sam Altman tweeted just the word Her the day that they released it. So it's like after Scarlett Johansson said no, and by the way, I think right up to the week where they released this, he was still asking her if they could do this, and she said no. They boasted that it sounded like the character Her played by Scarlett Johansson. Now, they have since taken that down, but it treads all over a lot of copyrights. Now, you might be saying to yourself, is there anything wrong with getting a sound-alike? Well, there is precedent here with it was 2 TV commercials. One was one of my favorite musical artists, Tom Waits. Tom Waits passed on, I think it was a beer ad, and so they found a sound-alike. He sued them in one. And another one was Bette Midler, and I think both of these happened in the 90s, and they got one of Bette Midler's backup singers to sing a jingle or something in the style of Bette Midler, and both of them won that lawsuit. There are guardrails around sound-alikes, and they haven't released who the actor was who did the Scarlett Johansson sounding voice, which almost leads me to believe that it might still they might have made a sample of Scarlett Johansson, although it does sound different enough that I can believe that it's not really her.
Well, okay, so here's my question. Let's say someone out there just happens to sound like Scarlett Johansson, and they go and they find that person and then have them do this. Does that person have some sort of inalienable rights then to their own likeness and voice? Do they then have the right to sell it to the Sam Altmans of the world? I'm asking because I really don't know.
Well, that's the problem that they're running into, and that's what the Tom Waits and the Bette Midler cases reflect.
I thought those cases might be like they were specifically asking them to do a impersonation.
Well, I guess that's the real question. Can they prove that OpenAI asked whoever this was to do an impersonation of Scarlett Johansson, or even that they just went out of their way to cast someone who just happened to sound exactly like Scarlett Johansson, or not exactly, but pretty damn close?
Yeah, I had a real problem with all of this, of course. It's so like underhanded and dirty. It's such like,
it's basically saying, give us your likeness or we will do the next nastiest thing to stealing it from you.
That's exactly right. They basically went out and then figured out how they could defraud Scarlett Johansson. So I think that she's filed a lawsuit against them to a cease and desist. I hope that she wins.
And by the way, they did cease and desist. They pulled that voice. And they have several other voices. And the thing is that these voices are creepy real sounding. If you listen to them, they do sound like real people. I understand that, I don't think it's even wrong for Sam Altman to say, like, we have it within our power to create a virtual assistant that would be indistinguishable from the character played by Scarlett Johansson in the movie Her. But then when ScarJo says, no, just don't, I know that it sounds perfect to you, Sam, but the tech bros got to throttle back on this stuff, because as much of a defender of AI as I have been, I kind of feel like this oversteps. And this isn't even AI overstepping. This is just
this is a human. This is a human
gross
overstepping.
Producer. It's just icky and gross, and I want it to stop.
Yeah, and imagine if it wasn't Scarlett Johansson. Imagine if it was some, workaday SAG actor who does maybe regional commercials or whatever it is, and they decided, we really like that person. We're just going to rip them off. Yeah,
that's the promise that even the AMPTP companies leveled at SAG when they were saying, hey, extras, come in, we'll pay you for a day, we'll scan your body, and then we'll own your likeness, and you'll have no say over where we use it, and you will never be paid again. And I'm like, and the upside for them is what? 1 day's pay? Go fuck yourself. That's really all you can come down to at that point, is like, just because you invented a neat technology, it belies the thing that I keep saying, which is that you still need the human element for this to work. And they can't make it work without the human element on some level. They can't just synthesize a voice. They need to base it on a data set. That data set is a human's voice that was made by a person who is an actor, who is a performer. You know what I mean?
I got to say, I'm not going to say that I'm bullish, but I'm certainly not totally pessimistic either on where AI is going. And I actually think that people like Michael Cioni have a really, really good handle on it, of AI removing repetitive tasks and tasks that
Michael's a genius. No question about it.
But the idea that OpenAI comes knocking to Hollywood and says, oh, you better start playing ball with us or we're going to, put you all out of business with our amazing technology. I think it's all bullshit. They can't do it. They certainly can't do it in the way that they are portraying that they can do it. And when they themselves don't understand how they're pulling off the trick, they don't understand what input equals what output. It's a house of cards. When you say that you don't have a business model, but you're going to ask your AI what your business model is someday, man, it's so wrong. It really feels like I can't believe anyone takes it seriously. It's like, I
think it is to be taken seriously in that it will cost jobs. And people will not get work because some dingus up the food chain will say, well, we don't need to hire someone to do this. And even if they eventually lose their job or they eventually have to hire someone to do it, it's going to be an extra stupid complication that we're all going to have to deal with. I think that the Michael Cioni approach to AI via things like Strata is the correct one. And I think that the thing about creative work is we love doing it, or we wouldn't be doing it. God knows we're not doing it for the money. So, so I feel like what we need is AI to keep us doing the creative stuff. And I don't know. I mean, there was a recent George Lucas quote about how the inevitability of AI in movie making, and I think it is inevitable that like it's going to find its way into visual effects. It already has. It already
has. Yeah.
But like what it's found its way to is iterating things that an artist would be doing anyway, and often presenting them with options that it would have just taken them longer to reach the same place, and real artists are still doing the real art. And I feel like Scarlett Johansson, thankfully for her, is in a powerful enough position in this industry where she can say, no, you can't take this away from me. You can't just do whatever you want.
I think I love Scarlett Johansson more and more every day. It seems like she's always doing something that I feel like is really smart. She was so great on Saturday Night Live a few weeks ago. So anyway,
she's awesome.
So Ben, why don't we get to the interview with Scott Ross?
Here we go.
The Cinematography Podcast interview.
So when I've looked into kind of your background, you went to Hofstra, and then at some point you ended up running ILM, and and you know, ILM, like even when I was in high school, I knew all about ILM. I have that somewhere still, that giant book, ILM, The Art of Special Effects. I feel like ILM was one of the first major pioneers, and you would know infinitely more than I would about this, but like what was there before ILM? Was there ever like a standalone high-end like A-list VFX house that just made top-line effects for movies?
Well, there was Doug Trumbull, right? Mm-hmm. So Doug Trumbull in 2001: A Space Odyssey and all of that stuff. And additionally, at the time, there were also a bunch of studio-owned and operated visual effects companies. So included within Disney was like Buena Vista Visual Effects.
Yeah.
So the studios have gone through like transitions. You know, in the beginning, I was like, gosh, this visual effects stuff is neat in the 50s and 60s. And then all of a sudden it became expensive for them and they were losing money, and they said, we really don't need it. And then they shuttered those all down. And then, you know, Star Wars happened. And once Star Wars happened, it was like, holy cow, we really need some visual effects. So that's when we sort of started seeing independent visual effects companies come of age, you know, whether it was Industrial Light and Magic or Boss Films or Apogee or DreamQuest Images or, you know, VFX. And then at some point, as visual effects became really critical to international box office and domestic box office as well, the studios started going, oh my God, maybe we should have these visual effects companies in-house again, because what happens if the big companies get booked by other studios and we can't get our films out? So that's when they started bringing, you know, Warner Brothers Digital, the Secret Lab at Disney, and they started to bring visual effects companies back into the studio. And then they quickly realized, wow, this is crazy. We're losing a ton of money.
Yeah, I bet.
We can, you know, have vendors lose money as opposed to us lose money. And so they shuttered them mostly all down, except for Sony. Sony continued in the business.
And to me, this is an interesting thing too that you bring up, is that Star Wars was the thing that got people doing this. Why not 2001: A Space Odyssey? Why not Doug Trumbull's freaking masterpiece? And Stanley Kubrick, it should be mentioned.
And that other guy, yeah.
That other dude.
You know, I'm really not sure, except that Star Wars was really a cultural phenomenon. Right. I mean, it crossed boundaries of, this is just a really cool film to take LSD and sit down and watch split screen, you know, in 1968. At the end of the day, it's show business, and it's much more business than it is show. And once Star Wars reached astronomical box office heights, then all of a sudden everybody in the studios got hip to the fact that, hey, you know, this visual effects stuff is pretty cool. We need it.
Yeah. And I always think of the 70s too as, like, among other things, a time when sort of like previously debased B-movie subgenres like gangster, sci-fi, horror, they all became huge mainstream movies. So you've got 10 years before you'd have B movies doing all that stuff. And then you've got The Godfather, and you've got The Exorcist, and you've got Star Wars. And these are huge mainstream films. And people like in The Exorcist, Dick Smith creates all this amazing, makeup effect stuff, but Dick Smith doesn't become ILM. ILM is kind of a one-stop shop, and that even includes stuff like makeup effects. Like they would do everything, soup to nuts, models, spaceships, masks, all that stuff, right?
Yeah, so I guess makeup effects were never really a part of the visual effects part, which was, later on when I founded Digital Domain, one of my partners was Stan Winston, he was one of the leading, makeup effects guys around. And so, makeup effects was almost, always separated from visual effects. But the soup to nuts concept happened because nobody was doing soup to nuts. And in fact, a lot of the things that Industrial Light and Magic did, particularly in the early days, with, multi-plane matte cameras or motion control stepper motors and things like that, came as a result of a necessity. Right. It was something that needed to happen for the Star Wars films. And because it was invented and really sort of the first time ever utilized, it happened all under one roof in Van Nuys with John Dykstra, sort of heading the team.
That's so crazy. I'm like 2 miles from there right now. It's super weird to me. But obviously none of it's there anymore. So walk me through how you ended up being like the general manager at ILM, because that's huge. And you show up there, or you end up running the place, like sort of after the initial Star Wars.
Yeah, I mean, when I got there, it was sort of a perfect storm. So filmmaking in the Bay Area was somewhat limited. There were basically two big companies, which was Zoetrope, headed by Francis, and Lucasfilm, headed by George. And then there was the rest of the industry, and the rest of the industry was often commercials, corporate videos, etc. And the two worlds never met. So I was running a company called One Pass Film and Video, which was the preeminent video production, post-production company in the Bay Area. I came up through the ranks as a sound guy, and then was hired by the owner of One Pass to be the head of production operations, and then ultimately became its president. And at the same time, I was elected president of the Film Tape Council in San Francisco. So my name was out there, and I was really heavily involved in film and TV in the Bay Area. But Lucasfilm, for example, was cloistered. So I knew nobody that worked at Lucasfilm, and I don't think anybody at Lucasfilm really knew who I was. And the reason it was cloistered, in my opinion, was because it was the preeminent place to do film in the Bay Area, and everybody that worked at Lucasfilm was so freaking scared that they would be replaced, or that someone would find out that there was a better person at their job than the job that they were doing. So they didn't get into the mix, into the zeitgeist of what was happening in film in the Bay Area. They very much were cloistered. Additionally, when I first got to ILM, it also seemed to me that not only were they separated and private amongst the community of the film world in the Bay Area, they were also separated and private department to department. So they weren't willing to share knowledge between, let's say, the optical department and the animation department and the roto department, because everybody was so scared of losing their jobs because their jobs were cyclical, right? Yeah. It wasn't like being in Los Angeles and the work kept coming in. So the work would come in and then the work wouldn't come in, and then everybody get laid off. So that was the nature of ILM. So I was, now the president of One Pass, and One Pass had been acquired by a publicly traded printing company. And their concept was that video was going to replace printing. And since they were a printing company for books, they thought video was going to be the new books. Now we're talking in the early to mid 1980s.
Yeah, right? I'm like, how did they think that was going to happen?
Well, that was their vision. They visioned that all of a sudden video was everywhere. People were buying VHS tapes, and they thought that VHS tapes would be the new books. And so they thought that, well, if we're in the business of printing books, we should be in the business of printing video. And so what was printing video? It was video post-production houses. So they wound up acquiring One Pass, and at the same time wound up acquiring the Editel company, which was the largest video post-production company in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And so now overnight, we became the largest video post-production company in the world. And there were people that were moving around, and I wound up becoming the president of the San Francisco office called OnePass. Through that, all of a sudden, these folks from Menasha, Wisconsin started looking at a creative company, which OnePass was a creative company, as a manufacturing company. They were literally measuring videotape that was crossing the heads of videotape machines. Like, what was your output today? So the whole mindset of running the company had changed. And once that happened, I started becoming really disgruntled because that was not the company that I wanted to work at and run. And I get a phone call from a headhunter that says, hey, Lucasfilm is looking for somebody to head up production operations at Industrial Light and Magic. And my head exploded because that was the holy grail. If you're going to live in San Francisco, you want to work at Lucasfilm. And
even today.
That's how I got hired.
Just amazing. So ILM, you're walking into ILM 88. This is like probably Indiana Jones in the Last Crusade era.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Oh, man.
So I walk into ILM while Who Framed Roger Rabbit's going on. Now, you have to understand, I haven't touched celluloid or been around celluloid film post-production since college, right? 16 millimeter Bell and Howells, So now when I get to ILM, everything is analog photochemical. And I just came from a place where everything was transputer-based and digital, right? And I couldn't quite grok why the hell are we sending these 5-second pieces of celluloid with runners to go to Monaco Labs across the bay and wait a day or two to get it back so we could see it. And then when we see it, it's not working, we got to do it again. It just blew my mind. So I happened to be in the right place at the right time, and having come from the right place, that I was a proponent of creating digital film and digital film technology.
But that was still probably, another 10, 11 years away from being...
Oh, no. By 1989, we had a Selco film recorder, and we were still shooting on film and VistaVision, right?
Yeah.
Brain structure and issues. Still shooting on VistaVision. And we were then using a developed breadboard film scanner that was built at Pixar back in the day, and it would crash every 10 minutes. And we would scan the film digitally and then work in a digital domain for doing the visual effects at that time, and then ultimately use a Selco film recorder to spit it back out to celluloid film. And so that was the beginning of digital film process.
Interesting. And of course, that's going to directly inform The Abyss, Jurassic Park, Terminator
2, yeah.
Like all those movies that kind of pushed that technology as far as it had ever been pushed at that time. I don't know if you watched stuff that's about all the people but the Disney Plus documentary Light and Magic, which is a pretty comprehensive history leaning towards hagiography, but a history of ILM. But it's fascinating, and it's full of all that. I feel like that and Jurassic Punk are like two really good companion pieces to watch, because you kind of get the other story.
One is very much whitewashed. What it did when I watched it, towards the end, I was getting a little pissed off because it wasn't Jim Morris, who was the guy who brought digital filmmaking and digital capabilities to Industrial Light and Magic as the general manager. It was me. Right. Yeah. And I've sort of been written out of ILM's history because I started Digital Domain. So, the powers that be at ILM, George, et cetera, have now whitewashed the situation, and I'm no longer, in the annals of ILM general managers, which is interesting because during my tenure, we transitioned from an analog company to a digital company, and I'd like to believe I had something to do with it.
Yeah, that's really what not just ILM is, but that's what
the entire industry is.
Yeah, the whole VFX industry is now sort of what you guys did during that period of time. It's crazy. On the one hand, there's a part of me that loves the tactile idea of physical matte paintings and models and blowing up little things and all that stuff. But it's impossible to deny that computers doing this stuff has opened up possibilities no one could have ever imagined before.
To the benefit and the detriment of filmmaking.
Yeah. Yeah, because you look at something like, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which, was done reasonably analog. It's hand-drawn animation
all
frames.
analog.
Yeah.
All analog.
And like that movie, I honestly think it holds up. I've watched it pretty recently. I think it holds up. I think that it looks amazing. The compositing is amazing. And, it just had to be, when you think about the level of preparation that Robert Zemeckis and everyone involved in that film must have had to do to just be like, okay, here's going to be the shot. And then Baby Herman's going to walk between their legs. So that's coming, and figuring out how to do every one of those gags, because it's just wall-to-wall sight gags.
It is. And poor Bob Hoskins, who basically is on a freezing cold soundstage in England, on an elevated soundstage, interacting with a broomstick with a rabbit head on it. But, I mean, think about acting. Hoskins said he'd never do it again.
Did they at least bring Charles Flesher out to like puppeteer the broomstick?
No.
And do the voices? No. Oh, wow.
No.
So it's just like a board script supervisor saying, "No, yeah. Eddie."
Exactly right.
Oh, man. That's rough. I feel like today probably there would be an argument for bring him out. But also, like, I do wonder if you were going to make a movie like Who Framed Roger Rabbit today, if it would feel like, because the opposite then ends up happening, and I'm jumping way forward, but like, when you see some of these movies where it's just like, I feel like everyone was shot in front of a green screen talking to a tennis ball on a C-stand, like everything is possible, but as a viewer, like it's hard to accept any of it. Like all of it feels like the best looking video game you ever saw.
Right. All we have to do is look at the remake of Star Wars, and remember that scene where all of these spaceships are flying behind them when the Jedi Knights are meeting. It's like, do we really need all those spaceships? Do we it totally detracts from the actual scene. The scene is happening, between the Jedi Masters. I don't need, and George was, enamored with it, and let's throw another, because that's the way it would look. Well, I don't care about the way it would look. You're making a film. So, direct the viewer's attention and attract his attention based upon what's happening in the scene, not what's happening in the background. Right?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, we don't get this too much on the podcast, but we'll occasionally get old-timer types who are like, oh, it was better to shoot it on film because it meant that you had more discipline. And I'm like, digital looks great. Who cares? Whatever tool works is great. But I do think that if one thing is kind of lost, it's the sense of discipline in your head of like, what do we need in each shot? If you couldn't just keep the camera rolling indefinitely, what would you be fighting your ass off for? And, time is still the limiting factor that you can't get around anyway. So,
and money.
Yeah, you run up against that. But I do agree where it's like VFX, it's the Jurassic Park problem. They asked if they could before they wondered if they should in right. so many cases. Not the effects themselves or the ability to do them, but what is done with them sometimes. And when you see Guillermo del Toro using them, I feel like he uses them very sensibly and judiciously and intelligently. And I'm not going to name other people who I don't feel like do it as well. But like that was kind of the Pandora's box that got opened by creating these tools that now, what I have on the computer I'm talking to you on right now in After Effects, I can do so many things in it that it would have been incomprehensible, would have saved Who Framed Roger Rabbit probably tens of millions of dollars.
So it's interesting that you bring that up. So particularly because of international box office becoming so critical and in some ways dwarfing domestic box office, the language for filmmaking has become visual effects. It's no longer that Tom Hanks is in the movie and that's going to drive the movie, because it's now the reel that's put together that's visually mind-blowing that will be playing in Tokyo and Beijing and Shanghai and, and Buenos Aires, et cetera, that will put butts in the seats.
So what convinces you that it's time to start your own company in digital domain and move beyond ILM? Was it your decision? What prompted you to leave ILM?
There was a real issue between the president of the company, Doug Norby, and myself. And when I got to ILM, there were lots of problems. There were technology problems because George and Doug was hired. Doug was a finance guy. Mm-hmm. So he was hired by George to oversee all of Lucasfilm because Lucasfilm was burning money left and right? George wasn't making movies and all of the companies were losing money. Skywalker was losing money.
That's really weird to me, is that like he didn't make any movies for so long.
I think, again, this is conjecture, but I think because I never really met the guy, I think he was still licking his wounds from Howard the Duck. He was like a world-class athlete, came out, won the World Series. Everything he touched turned to gold. And then he goes out and he produces Howard the Duck, and it's the laughing stock of the industry. And so I think that just hit him hard. He's an introvert. And so to step up to the plate and strike out, to use a sports analogy, I think it just devastated him. Plus, he was going through a divorce. So he really retreated. So as I said, while I was there, first running Industrial Light and Magic, and then running 90% of Lucasfilm, being promoted up the chain, I never really had a one-on-one with George. Actually, I did once after I was let go. I wound up seeing him in a restaurant, in a Mexican restaurant. I was fired. And I walked over to George and I said, hey, I just want to let you know that my experiences in Industrial Light and Magic and Lucasfilm has been great. I've learned a lot and I want to thank you. And he looked me in the eye and he said, and you are?
Really?
Really.
Wow.
Talk about absentee landlords. He had
That's
no
crazy.
idea who I was.
Well, that's funny because, to watch that Disney Plus documentary, Light and Magic, my takeaway from that was the reason that George Lucas wasn't making movies all those years is because he was up to his neck in the technology and pushing ILM. But yeah, you're shaking your head. I don't know. I mean, it's look, man, he gave us Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and he doesn't have to do anything else. And honestly, Howard the Duck tanked, but everyone's allowed a freaking mulligan, especially after you reinvent the industry in the way that he did.
After you have 18 birdies.
Exactly. Exactly, to torture some more sports metaphors. Yeah. But how many movies? I mean, Steven Spielberg had 1941 and just kept on trucking. I mean, I just feel like every filmmaker of any consequence has a movie that everyone goes what? And then it's well, I took a weird swing and I kept going. It's weird. It's weird to think that. I know he executive produced a movie called The Radioland Murders around that time, and I have heard stories that he would be on set, sort of directing second unit or kind of keeping his hands in it a little bit. But his films became a little bit more producer driven. But it wasn't until the end of the '90s that he directed anything again. It's kind of crazy,
right?
And then did 3 and then left again.
Yeah. So Norby and I had this issue, right? So I inherited ILM with all of these problems: technology problems, work problems, issues about amount of hours that people were working. One of our guys died of a heart attack. The union was beside themselves. It was the union shop at the time. And when I got there, I had to turn the whole company around. So I turned it into a profitable company. We bought a bunch of gear, even though the ranch and Norby wouldn't allow me to do it. I just did it. I didn't ask any questions. I had my own finance department and my own PR department and my own legal department. And I just said, screw it. I see the future and I'm going to do what I need to do. And, supported with the likes of Spaz and DePay and Scott Squires and John Knoll and Dennis Murin, I just did it. And so things at ILM happened and we started winning awards again, and the company was proud of themselves, and, the employees got along and we would have parties. And so the entire zeitgeist of ILM was reinvigorated. As a result of that, again, I think Norby said, holy shit, I've been trying to figure this out. And my take, because he was the finance guy, was he was a brake pedal. So all he wanted to do was stop the bleeding. And the way he stopped the bleeding is laid people off, closed down divisions, got rid of perks, no bagels, that was his attitude. And mine was exactly the opposite. His didn't work and mine did. And so Norby saw me as a threat. And once he saw me as a threat, he couldn't really fire me because my reviews were spectacular. I turned around a division and made it profitable. So he offered me another job, which was now to take over THX, Skywalker Sound, Lucasfilm commercials. And so my plate got a lot bigger. And at first I told him I didn't want it. And he said, well, if you don't take it, I'm going to fire you. I said, excuse me? He said, because if you don't take it, you're not a company guy. I'm going to fire you. I'm going to let you go. I said, okay, I'll take it. So are you going to pay me anymore? He said, no, I'm not going to pay anymore. I said, well, why would I take on this mess just to, come on. He said, well, if you don't take it, I'm going to fire you. So I took it. And now we put together a bonus plan for the creatives and executives in the company. And when we did that, ILM hit the ball out of the park, to use another tortured sports analogy. And Norby had decided he wasn't going to pay bonuses. He just reneged on his promise. We put together a bonus plan. Everybody did really well. And my execs, who were really underpaid considering what was happening in Silicon Valley at the time, they revolted. They were really upset. So I walked into Doug's office and I said to Doug, listen, we either have to figure out a way to pay these people because you promised them and I supported your promise, or I'm leaving. And he pulled out my resignation papers right then and there and handed it to me and said, sign it. Bye.
Yikes. That's awful.
Yeah. So I left, and then the Academy Awards were next week, and George finally received an Academy Award. He received the Irving Thalberg Award, I think the only Academy Award that he ever received. And that day, the San Francisco newspapers headlines were Earth Wars at Lucasfilm. And there was this big revolt. Once everybody found out that I had been let go, there was this giant meeting and the staff was demanding Norby's resignation and where the hell is Scott Ross? And it was volatile. And George knew nothing about it, of course. So when the press came over to him on the night he won the Irving Thalberg Award, he was bombarded by press asking him all kinds of questions about his company, of which he knew nothing about.
Oh, man.
So he gets back and the first thing that he does is he fires Doug Norby.
Oh, wow.
So now I think, okay, great. So I try to get in touch with George again. I can't. I speak to his attorney and I say to him, hey, listen, I basically run the company now. I've made all these divisions profitable. You're paying me anyway. I'm on a severance agreement. Bring me back. Let me be the president of the company. And he said, George has decided that because you quit, you're no longer welcome within the Lucasfilm companies. So now here I was out of a job, and
but
I had nothing.
You didn't like quit. You were like served resignation papers.
That's correct. Yeah. So now here I am. I've got a wife that's not working. I got 3 kids. I own a home in Marin, and the good news is I had runway of 9 months because I had a severance agreement.
Yeah.
So now what am I going to do, right? And so ultimately, Digital Domain came as a result of that.
So, but like at that time, was I in film school? No, this would have been, what year would that have been?
Would have been 1992.
Yep, I would have been, that's right when I was in film school. So I was paying attention to this stuff, and I wasn't really aware of another company that was a competitor to ILM at that time. It really didn't exist. We didn't have like what we have now, like Weta, obviously, and Animal Logic, and
Frame Store, and blah blah blah.
Yeah. I mean, there's dozens of them now. But at the time, it was like ILM was the only company. Like whenever you would see a big Star Trek movie, Star Trek 5 or whatever, it would be ILM was doing all the big effects.
Correct.
Well, I mean, I guess this is like a story of basic capitalism, which is like they're running their business badly, so someone's going to compete with them. And you were uniquely suited to go do that.
Well, I wasn't the first one, so there were, this Disney ILM or Light and Magic series really shed a lot of light on why things were the way they were at ILM when I got there. So, if you watch episodes 1 and 2 or whatever it was, clearly, John Dykstra is the reason why Industrial Light and Magic worked. He was the force, the brains, the charisma. And I didn't know John Dykstra when I.
Yeah, they gave him the heave-ho, right? Like
why did they give him the heave-ho? Well, they gave him the heave-ho because he was a powerful person. He was an extrovert. He was brilliant. He was driven. He was passionate. He was well-spoken. In many ways, the exact opposite of what George Lucas was, right? Introverted, not comfortable around people. And so interesting, what happens is when he brings the company up north, who does he bring? He brings Dennis Muren, who's very much like George Lucas, an introvert, not out there, not a lot of attitude, not a lot of passion. And so that's sort of the light bulb went on for me, which is I was much more like John Dykstra than I was like Dennis. And so I didn't really have a home there. Yeah.
Yeah, Dennis Muren is practically the villain of Jurassic Punk. Well, the way that movie positions it is that he's sort of undermining the accomplishments of Steve Williams at every turn and not taking credit for what Steve did, but not taking credit for what Steve did.
Yeah, I mean, there's that old line, there's my truth, there's your truth, and somewhere in between there's the truth.
Yeah.
Dennis is brilliant, and Dennis did great work. Part of the reason why I think Spaz and DePay and those guys got pushed aside by people like Dennis is because they were mavericks. They were wild guys. And Dennis is the exact opposite of a wild guy. He's very reserved and very careful and, very soft-spoken, etc. And Spaz is, this drunken Canadian crazy man.
Yeah. No, he seemed certainly like a handful, and maybe not like someone who I want to work in the next cubicle over from, but obviously what he did change the industry.
He did.
Like everyone is kind of riding right down the path he blazed to this day.
Correct.
Which to me is, it's utterly fascinating. So when you set out to create Digital Domain, were you thinking let's get John Dykstra type people, let's get Steve Williams types? I know Steve Williams was still at ILM, I think, at that time.
He was, yeah.
Obviously, Stan Winston, not known as a madman, but certainly an extremely innovative artist.
And a character, yeah. In our partnership, Stan was, I used to call him the rabbi, right? Because Stan was caught in between Jim and I. So Jim and I were very strong personalities. And, and as I used to say, the reason why Jim and I broke up is because we had religious differences. He thought he was God and I didn't agree. And, he's got a reputation that supports that. And Stan was the guy who was always trying, can't you guys just figure it out? Can't you just make it work? Unfortunately, when push came to shove, it's Hollywood, and Jim Cameron's the biggest, gorilla on the block. And if it wasn't for Jim, Stan wouldn't have those Academy Awards. And so at the end, Stan would also always side with Jim. And
and we've had Russell Carpenter on the program a couple of times, and including we actually talked to him about Avatar 2, and he confirmed for me, and maybe you can double confirm for me or refute. But the thing about James Cameron that I've always heard is that he could literally walk to anyone on the set and be like, "You're fired," sit in their chair and do their job better than they were doing it. Almost anyone. It could be the sound mixer, could be the gaffer, could be the boom guy, could be the VFX guy. And his storyboards that he personally draws are some of the best looking storyboards I've ever seen.
I would say that, on a production set, that's generally true, right? I'm not sure Jim could be, a sound guy, but he understands sound and what needs to happen almost as well as the sound guy, right? Yeah. And while Jim, oftentimes has grabbed the camera out of a DP's hand and shot things, I mean, he's what's the guy who shot The Natural? Caleb Deschanel?
Yeah.
Right. So interestingly, he had hired Caleb Deschanel to do Titanic. And
that actually seems like a perfect choice. Although,
it was my suggestion.
Russell killed it. Russell did such a great job, but
I was enamored with the things that Caleb was doing. And Jim and I had a conversation, and I said, if you're going to hire a DP, you should hire Caleb. And he did. And so on the set, Jim was acting as the DP. He was telling Caleb what to do. And eventually Caleb just went, why am I here? And that's when Caleb left, and then he brought in Russell.
Yeah.
So as far as the visual effects are concerned, I don't think he could sit down and, run Nuke. I don't think he could do spline animation, but he's as informed and as understanding of the process as any visual effects supervisor.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that doesn't surprise me. So who are all of the initial people in Digital Domain? Was this a heist movie where you were Danny Oceans? You were like, I'm putting together a team and going around and handpicking people, or was it something that was kind of already in the air?
So when I was at ILM and Lucasfilm, one of the things that I and several others tried to do is we tried to buy Lucasfilm, LucasArts, right? ILM, THX, Skywalker, et cetera, from George. Because George was supposedly, again, through Norby, always complaining about the fact that these companies were losing money and why was he in it and blah, blah, blah. And so management buyouts were definitely the word of the day in Silicon Valley. And I thought, why not put together a management/creative buyout of these several divisions and go to George and say, well, keep your name on the door. We'll offer you sweetheart deals if you ever make a movie again, but let us own the company and run it. And so we actually got a major banker to come to us and say, I think we could raise the money to do it. And we were shot down, right? So the people that were on my team, I was the tip of the spear. The people that were on my team were, Kenny Ralston and Dennis Murin and Jim Morris and Marty Schindler and Ed Jones and all of the key technical, creative, and management people at Industrial Light and Magic. And once it got shot down, they all bailed. And I was sort of standing there naked without my clothes on going, oh, and so ultimately when that bonus thing went down, I was asked to leave. When I left, I didn't think about Jim Cameron at all because the thought of being in business with another director, frankly, scared the crap out of me. But my then wife said to me, Scott, if you start a company, you might get some people that come and work for you, but if you have Jim Cameron involved or a major director, they'll definitely come. So there was a guy named Scott Billups who was a friend of mine, and he said, I was just talking to Cameron and talking to him about what you're doing, and he said he was interested. Now I knew Jim, right, from The Abyss and from Terminator 2. And Jim called me and said, hey, listen, I understand what you're doing. I'd like to be a part of it. And then I said, okay, once I had that conversation with my wife, I said, okay. And we had a meeting in Burbank, and all of a sudden Stan Winston's there. It's like, well, wait a second. I didn't talk to you about Stan. Oh, no, Stan's great. And Stan's going to be a part of the company. I said, oh, okay. So now it was Stan, Jim, and I. And for all intents and purposes, Jim and Stan now went on with their business. Jim was making movies, and Stan was running Stan Winston Studio. And it was sort of just me. And so I started hiring people. And the first group that I went to were my ILM buddies. Mm-hmm. And so I went to Spaz and DePay and said, hey, I'm starting this new company with Jim Cameron. Are you interested? And they said, I don't want to move to LA. And thank you. I wish you the best of luck. So, we started pulling people from disparate places. Once we made the announcement, there were people at Boss Films, there were people at Apogee, there was people at Metrolite, there were a few people at ILM that I brought over, and we started to put together a team of folks. And in the beginning, it was very difficult because we were all speaking different languages. It's really how the processes at like Boss Films was significantly different in the pipeline from what was happening in ILM. So we had to form a language that allowed us to work together. And that took about a year and a half.
Wow. Yeah. But even right out of the gate, you guys were doing some pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah. Because that we had Jim and Stan as part of the company, we had access to filmmakers. So like take Interview with a Vampire, Neil Jordan was working with Stan, and Stan said, really should do your effects at Digital Domain. And Jordan went, well, if Stan thinks it's good, I'll work there. So, we had a lot of breaks that happened for us.
How did Stan Winston feel about, sorry, this just popped into my head, about a guy who made a living making physical things, about working for a company or partnering in a company called Digital Domain, where my assumption is the idea was to not make any physical things?
So Stan walks out of Jurassic Park doing what he did in Jurassic Park, ILM doing what they did in Jurassic Park, and all anybody's talking about in the press, in Hollywood, in the industry, etc., is Industrial Light and Magic. Holy cow, did you see those computer-generated dinosaurs? Nobody's talking about animatronic dinosaurs or things that happened, that were state-of-the-art over the last 10 or 15 years. They wanted to talk about this new revolution. And the new revolution was computer-generated imagery and computer-generated animation. And so everybody was talking about ILM. So Stan, being a forward thinker, went, shit, what do I do? And so he wound up in Stan ways of, acquiring a bunch of computers, but he acquired the wrong ones because he didn't know anything about it. And so he started a CGI division within Stan Winston Studio, which was going nowhere. So when Stan wound up joining Digital Domain, one of the things I needed to do, according to Jim, was to hire the people he had in his CGI group and buy all of his computers and pay him back for the money that he spent on these Silicon Graphics monster machines, which frankly, I didn't really want, but it was the price of entry.
Wow. It's interesting to think. I mean, it's like my mind went like, well, it'd be like Jim Henson doing that. And then I'm like, well, they made cartoons. Yeah. Well, and also like, even if you look at movies
Phil Tippett.
Yeah.
Right, Phil Tippett, same thing. Here's a creature guy, and now he starts his own visual effects computer-oriented digital company, Tippett Studios.
Yeah. That guy is fascinating. Like, he just seems like one of the... Have you seen Mad God, the stop motion movie he made?
I haven't, no.
It's nuts. It's not like there's not really much of a plot, but it's just like all of these crazy, very well realized worlds. I guess it was something he started like 20 years ago and then finished like last year. So awesome. So did Digital Domain open the door? I mean, like Weta obviously is connected to Peter Jackson, but there's plenty of VFX houses that were not connected to a specific filmmaker. Like I don't know if like Rhythm and Hughes or any of those were connected to a specific person. They were just standalone VFX shops. But did the creation of Digital Domain, do you think that opened the door for people to go like, oh yeah, if we get enough computers and enough artists, we could compete with ILM?
Yeah, I mean, I think what happened. I mean, if you look at ILM spawns Apogee Films because Dykstra is not asked to join ILM when they go up north. Richard Edlund is asked, but at some point he goes, "What the hell am I doing? I want to stay in LA." So he starts Boss Films. Then there was me with Digital Domain. So a lot of the companies that were secondary or tertiary visual effects companies came out of people that worked at other companies that were disgruntled by those companies and said, well, I can do that. I think, Sony Pictures ImageWorks was basically an offshoot of Metrolight. Tim McGovern and the folks come out of Metrolight and wind up at Sony Pictures ImageWorks. And then Kenny Ralston is hired out of Industrial Light and Magic to be the lead creative person at Sony Pictures ImageWorks. So, the core pioneering people at the top wind up getting either frustrated or feel that they could do something better. And it's the way it is. It's the way it is in all industries. People think, well, I could do that. And I'd rather, why are you the boss of me? I'm going to do it differently and I'm going to do it better.
So this brings me to the book that you're working on. All that I have been given to read is kind of the introduction, which is only a couple of pages long. But you talk about how, when you set up Digital Domain, you wanted it to be a rocket, or somebody paid you the compliment of it was a rock and roll VFX company. Tell me what that meant to you, but start with what made it rock and roll. And then let's start talking about like where the industry has ended up lately.
What I realized is that when I was at ILM, my personality and who I was, and the zeitgeist by which the company, I thought, became reinvigorated, had a lot to do with work hard, play hard, rock hard, right? As opposed to like this corporate sensibility of cubicles and whatnot, which is what I saw happening at Sony Pictures ImageWorks, right? And to an extent, what I saw happening at Industrial Light and Magic after I left. And so I recognized that people like Spaz and DePay are really critical to the creative process. And you need to give them enough rope and enough pasture to be able to go out there and raise hell. Now, there needs to be constraints, right? You can't do like really crazy shit, but you should allow creative people the opportunity to be themselves, to let the air out of the room, to run around, to be the kids that they want to be. Of course, always under adult supervision, but not by saying, you can't act that way. Don't do that. No, you can't party like that. No, turn down that music. And so to me, rock and roll meant you could do all of those things. And so when I started Digital Domain, I walked into Digital Domain and I noticed that the building that we wound up renting was the Chiat Day Advertising Agency. And on the top of the Chiat Day Advertising Agency, there was a pirate flag. And so I decided to keep the pirate flag there. And I decided to create a culture that was, we're the coolest people there are. And if you want to be part of the band, you're a pirate. And we're going to play hard and we're going to work hard and we're going to party hard. And that's the culture that I wanted to create. And I think generally did a pretty good job of it. There were people that were very talented that just didn't fall in line with that culture. They were straight or they were dweeby or whatever. And ultimately they would leave, because it wasn't the right fit for them. So I was always looking to cast a movie. And the cast that we had were pirates. That's who we were. Ultimately, what happens with the industry is that because there are no margins there, because people are not making any money, because there are certain companies that the only way that they could stay alive is by taking advantage of their employees, not paying them overtime, not having health and welfare, et cetera. And that really comes as a result of the way the clients and the studios and the directors deal with the visual effects companies. There's that famous line, if I'm not putting a visual effects company out of business, I'm not doing my job, from producers. So
Who said that?
Yeah, there's rumor that it was a person that now works closely with Jim Cameron,
Oh, wow.
who was the head of production at 20th Century Fox.
I mean,
Right.
what's the flip side of that? Like, because art is messy, and because, if you have a world full of Steve Williamses, they might go off in directions that aren't directly productive immediately all 100% of the time. So giving them, like you said, some pasture to dwell in, like if you did that too much and you were just given free rein to do it and paid well for it, would the budgets just mushroom out of control? Or like what's the happy medium as you see it? Where should it land? Because obviously, like again, when you have like Rhythm and Hughes, going into bankruptcy while winning an Oscar for doing something that was kind of revolutionary at the time, like, something's wrong. Something's very wrong in that business. And I feel like, and obviously Scott Liebrecht made a documentary called Life After Pi about that exact thing, in addition to Jurassic Punk. And I feel like, Scott, as someone who's worked in the VFX industry, has a lot of strong opinions about the way it can be done. But like, if you're a producer, what's the right way to work with a VFX house that's fair to the VFX house and also fair to the production and won't blow up, won't make a movie that already costs $150 million cost $250 million?
So if you have an adult at the helm of the visual effects company, and you have an adult at the helm of the visual effects movie, the production part of the visual effects, but that they recognize that life is not structured and all the I's aren't dotted and the T's aren't crossed, and you need to give people the flexibility to be able to create and change and make mistakes, that's the way you got to run a visual effects company. That being said, even though I felt that we did that very well at Digital Domain, the business model, the basic underpinnings of visual effects for the industry is just, it's a no-win situation for a visual effects company. You're given none of the power to ultimately make the decisions, and you're on a fixed budget. So here's $100. I want you to make a guitar. And you go and you start making the guitar, and I say, well, no, I want a 12-string. No, I want it to be rosewood fretboard. No, I want it. And you keep making these changes, but you still only have $100. And you got to deliver the guitar on January the 5th. Well, guess what? You're going to lose money, or you're going to not make money, right? And additionally, you don't have any back end. So if you take a movie like Gravity, for example, the star of Gravity was Framestore's visual effects work. I mean, Sandra Bullock and George Clooney, give me a break. It could have been anybody. Sandra Bullock made $70 million on Gravity. I'll make you a bet Framestore lost money.
Yeah, and to me, that's always been kind of like a weird thing, is that directors, writers, and actors get residuals, but VFX supervisors, DPs, editors, composers, wardrobe designers, makeup effects designers, and these are the people who like make all of the big swings in the movie.
That's right.
Don't get residuals. I'm not saying writers, directors, and actors shouldn't be getting residuals, but
Right.
when you look at a movie like Gravity, I mean, like obviously, Emmanuel Lubezki, the cinematographer, deserves enormous credit. Everybody deserves enormous credit, and Sandra Bullock probably deserves, and George Clooney deserve enormous credit for bringing people into the theater to see it in the first place.
Right.
Everybody has their piece of it. I've never understood why VFX supervisors don't have that piece of it, because depending on what it is, if you're making a movie where we had to paint out a barbecue in one shot, that guy doesn't necessarily deserve as much credit as the DP. But if you're making an Avengers movie or something like that, the VFX are in every shot.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I asked Cristofaria that very question, actually in public. And Cristofaria at the time was the head of Warner Brothers post-production and digital. And that was the studio that made Gravity. He was also a producer on the movie. And I asked him, so like, if you look at the credits in that movie, there were like, 500 visual effects credits.
Yeah.
And, there were 5 or 6 producers, and Sandra Bullock made $70 million. What's the deal? And he said, that's because the visual effects industry has nobody that is negotiating for them. So he said, the reason Sandra Bullock got that deal was because she had an agent, and the agent was aggressive, and the studio really wanted her. And so he was able to cut that deal. And so he said, visual effects companies don't have that. That was his response.
So how can they get that?
Well, I've always been a proponent of an international trade association. I think that, every industry has a trade association. The porn industry has a trade association. The visual effects industry needs an international trade association that changes the business model. The business model is a fixed fee contract, deliver on this date, and we can change stuff all over the place, right? That doesn't work. It works for the studio. It works for the director and the producer, but it does not work for the visual effects industry. So if you had an international trade association that represented all of the visual effects or most of the visual effects studios, you could change the business model, and the business model should be changed like production. Here's our budget. Here's our markup. By the way, we could give you absolute, the ability to see what we're spending on a day. You decide to make a change, it's overtime, just like a DP would get paid in production. Here's my fee for the day, but it's a 12-hour day or a 10-hour day, and my crew gets paid this. And if you make it an 18-hour day, I'm not making it an 18-hour day. You guys are. My people get paid overtime.
Yeah.
And so I think
seems obvious.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
It seems like if you treat it like it's a real, because what's ending up happening is like the companies are ending up having to shoulder that.
That's correct.
But because like the individual artists are going to be like, up yours, I'm going home. I need
That's
sleep.
correct. That's right.
And so, yeah.
Unfortunately, the individual artist winds up, and it's a traditional situation, winds up blaming management. So the reason why I'm working so long is because Scott Ross is making me work this long, right? What they don't understand, and they have a real difficult take on it, the reason you're working this long is because director XYZ is changing his or her mind, and that's why you're working that long. But director XYZ is their God. I want to be like George Lucas. And so George Lucas can do no wrong. But the guy who's running Industrial Light and Magic, he or she is making me work these ridiculous hours. And it's just not the case.
Yeah, and it almost kind of goes back to what you're talking about, or what we were talking about with Roger Rabbit, where it's like Robert Zemeckis probably did not roll camera unless he knew exactly how the shot was going to be worked on through the entire pipeline, because he didn't have an entire company that would band-aid up every fuck up that he made. The buck stopped with him. He had to know when he turned on the camera, okay, so, this is going to happen, then that's going to happen. And even like physical stuff was happening on set so that they could have the cartoons interact with it. But, I have friends who are VFX artists who are always complaining to me like, yeah, this director gave me this shot with no tracking markers, with no nothing, and they want me to add smoke here and an explosion. And I can't, I'm using the force to figure out even where to put it. Like, it's taking me forever to solve the problem they should have solved on set.
And by the way, and now you've solved the problem, and ultimately it goes up through the chain, through the animation supervisor to the visual effects supervisor to the director. And the director, because it's been telephoned, said, no, I didn't want it like that. I wanted it blue, right? So we do it again. And that's the reason why Godzilla -1 works so well, because the director was the visual effects supervisor. The director oversaw all the visual effects. So it was directly from the horse's mouth to the animator, move this, do that. And so there's efficiency. I think one of the unfortunate things about our industry, and I tell this to students whenever I speak, which is if you enter into an industry and you're the sound guy, and you're a really good sound guy, but what you really want to be as a director, they're going to do everything that they can, the industry is, to keep you as a sound guy, because you're a really good one. So why would I give you a shot to direct? Because I need you as a sound guy. So the limitations of being able to move from one area to another is very, very, very difficult.
You did it pretty well, though.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
You went from sound guy to running ILM in 11 years. Yeah. That's crazy.
That's not to say that it doesn't happen, but it's rare.
No, it's very hard, but it's like, again, you look at somebody like Gareth Edwards. There was a guy who I knew
Jim
years
Cameron.
ago. Yeah. He was an art director.
Yeah.
Production designer.
However, there have been world-class visual effects supers that have tried to direct and haven't been given a shot. John Bruno, Kenny Ralston, Rob Legato, etc. And for whatever reason, the doors don't open.
It's so weird, because you figure like even just in the commercial world or something, like people would understand the outrageous savings that they would get. I mean, like, as someone who has spent my life studying directing, I understand there's so much more to directing than understanding how to, like, there are two very different sets of skills, but they're also two learnable sets of skills. All right, man. Well,
I hope this has been helpful.
Very, very helpful. Thank you for your time, and thank you for everything that you've contributed to the industry. I feel like I could talk to you all day. I'm sorry we ran a little bit over.
We'll do the sequel.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
All right, so that was Scott Ross. Scott, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your stories, and thank you for running Digital Domain, one of the greatest visual effects companies that ever was and is.
Indeed, yeah.
And now, short ends.
All right, Ben, it is time for our short ends. It is time for our obsession of the week. Is there something that you are all about? What is your obsession this week?
I found a documentary on Canopy, of all places. I'm sure it's running other places, but if you have a library card, you can get it on Canopy. And it's from 2022, and it is called Lynch/Oz. It is a documentary about the Wizard of Oz within the work of David Lynch. And it's directed by a man named Alexandre or Alexander Felipe. Mm-hmm. I'm sure it's the French name, and I just butchered it. So sorry. And it features interviews with Rodney Asher and John Waters and Karen Kusama and Aaron Moorhead. It's got some great interviews. And it sort of is a deconstruction of David Lynch in a way that I have never seen anyone exactly do. It's impossible to watch too much David Lynch, especially movies like Wild at Heart, and not notice that there's a Wizard of Oz kind of thing going on in his work. But the Wizard of Oz, which feels like wholesome family entertainment, could not be further away from the creepy darkness of David Lynch. But all of these people kind of, what's interesting about this documentary is each one of them kind of dissects it, and you start to go like, oh yeah, there's a super obvious Wizard of Oz thing going on in David Lynch movies, right down to like just naming one of the main characters in Blue Velvet is named Dorothy. Like, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of people with red shoes. There's a lot of comparisons, but also each of these people kind of going into it kind of reveals something about themselves. John Waters is especially revelatory of himself, but so is Aaron Moorhead. So is Karen Kusama. And they kind of talk about their process. They talk about David Lynch's process. They talk about the Wizard of Oz. I'm not a knee-jerk David Lynch apologist. I love some of his work. I like some of his work. I don't like some of his work, but I think he's a very interesting filmmaker. I think he's one of the most interesting filmmakers who's been working for the last, 40 years. But to me, this was just like a nonstop, very engaging, very interesting, very creative. We talk about art, craft, and philosophy here a lot. This was art, craft, and philosophy. And I couldn't get enough of it. By the way, I want to give a shout out. This was my short end last week, was Cinema Tyler's Apocalypse Now series.
Sure was.
I have now burned through, I think, all of Cinema Tyler's channel's various videos. He does a lot of videos about Kubrick. He did a whole series about 2001: A Space Odyssey. He did a whole series about Full Metal Jacket. He's done a lot of Kubrick stuff. He did a great thing about the French Connection, and I just want to double down on that. We should get the guy on the show. If you like what we talk about with people, I would check Cinema Tyler and any of his freaking videos. The Apocalypse Now one I thought was finished, but apparently it's still, like, he dropped a new episode last week about Dennis Hopper, and I watched that, and it's just so well researched and so smart, and it's endlessly awesome. But anyway, that's a side note. Anyway, so I just accidentally did two. Ilya, what is your short end this week?
Well, I will make up for your going over with mine doing one extra truncated.
You're like, lenses are cool. Thank you. Bye.
And we're out. Close, but the Sony FX6 is possibly the most versatile and full-featured, micro miniature cinema camera out there. It's very inexpensive, extremely high quality, offers a lot of advanced features. That is not my short end. My short end is that there is a new firmware update that was just dropped today. So I just downloaded it a few minutes ago, and I'm very excited about this because the new firmware unlocks a feature which I was really hoping that they would. It's kind of as if like the Sony camera gods heard my prayers. We're opening a new Hot Rod Cameras Portland. I only had one camera on display for our sort of like preview opening that we did a few weeks ago, and it was the FX6. and I had these new 1.5 squeeze anamorphic lenses on there called Remus from a company called Blazar, and they're great lenses, and they're incredibly affordable. And mark my words, it is only a matter of time before someone makes an absolutely insanely great feature film using the Sony FX6 and some very inexpensive 1.5 times anamorphic lenses. Could be something from Blazar, could be something from Laowa. Both of them have these incredible, inexpensive little lenses. And now this new firmware for the FX6 unlocks the 1.5 times anamorphic D-squeeze inside the camera. And before that, you had to use a monitor. You had to use some external device to be able to see the images de-squeezed appropriately so you could see exactly what it was that you're doing. And there isn't exactly a perfect fit if you don't have a 1.5 D-squeeze built into a device. Like if you try to use 2 times D-squeeze, it doesn't look right. If you try to use no D-squeeze, it doesn't look right. You can kind of do a 1.3, but still it's a little bit off to be able to see what it is that you're shooting. And anamorphic has never been bigger. I was just watching Fallout again last night, and Fallout's all anamorphic. Almost everything these days seems like it's anamorphic. Of course, Shogun was anamorphic, tons and tons of anamorphic, and you can now get this incredible amount of quality in camera and lenses for almost no money. That camera, it's got a staying power. It's been out for years now, but it is easily on par with anything else out there that's $6,000 and really punches way above its weight. I mean, if you can make the creator on an FX3, which is the little brother of the FX6, the FX6 is even more capable. Mark my words, FX6 plus anamorphic lenses coming soon to a film festival near you. I think someone's going to do something amazing with this combination. And so the new firmware update.
I have a project that might be happening, and I might need to talk to you offline a little more about this.
Sure. Well, the new firmware, I haven't tried it yet because it literally came out today, but it's got a bunch of other features built into it too. Some improvements for LUT, some improvements for different lens compatibilities. But really the biggie for me is 1.5 times anamorphic D-squeeze now built into the camera. And that is just so perfect with some of the budget incredible lenses that have come to market recently. The Laowa nanomorphs are gorgeous. And you pair that with an FX6, it's a real winner. So anyway, there you go. That's my short end. Ben, where can people find you if they want to track you down outside of this show?
You can find me at benrock.com. Go to benrock.com and check out my stuff. See my reel or get links to the various things I've done, or find me on social media, add me on LinkedIn, whatever. No big whoop. How about yourself, Ilya? Where can people find you?
You can find me at Hot Rod Cameras, hotrodcameras.com. You can also find me on the LinkedIn and the Instagram. I know I mentioned it last week. Some people have been reaching out to me on Instagram.
How about TikTok? Can we find you on TikTok?
You can't find me on TikTok.
Me either. I mean, I have a TikTok account, but I have never posted a tick. What do you call that crap?
Anyway, Ben, who do we have to thank this week?
As always, maybe more so than usual, Ben Katz, who we gave maybe, let's just say, an overabundance of close focus stuff. And he pared it down, as always, brilliantly, I assume, because I'm saying this before he did that. But Ben's a brilliant editor, and I know he'll do a great job. We should thank Alana Cody, our producer. She's got us both hitting the interview trail this week. I know you just did one, I think, today. I got one on Thursday. So
I got one tomorrow.
I don't know what we would do without Alana. Yeah, she said she had a bunch for you. And last and also never least, Kay Zalatracci, who told me about the 9/11 tragedy, but also composed all the music that you hear on the podcast. Check him out at musicbykays.com. Hire him to compose your next score, or color correct your next feature, or direct your next feature, or do visual effects on your next feature. You can also hire his wife to write your next feature. Christina Lobata. All good people. And she also directs.
They're a multi-talented household, right?
I mean, who needs AI when you have those two? They've got it all the bases covered.
Before you know it, their dogs are going to be directing. Just,
Yeah, I mean, it takes about 10 years to get good at directing, and I got bad news, dogs. Unless the performance is, who's a good boy, you're not going to get much out of a dog.
All right, Ben, you want to take us out this week?
Until next time.
There you go. You got it.
This has been the Cinematography Podcast, presented by Hot Rod Cameras. Find your next camera, lens, or accessory on the web at hotrodcameras.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our show on iTunes and connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for listening.